All right, welcome back. This is going to be probably the final lecture for this chapter before the midterm. So we'll talk about immigration as a sort of, application of the models of supply and demand, see how we can work with equilibrium and slowly, um, add to the model to get a little bit more accurate results. And then we'll talk about a special case of the labor market or monopsonies. So George Borjas, the author of our textbook, is renowned for his work on immigration. He did a great paper on the effects of the Mariel boat lift and the sudden influx of Cuban immigrants in South Florida back in the 80s, and he's followed it up with a lot more work. So it's not really a surprise that he's including the employment effects of immigration in this chapter. So we can start here with a basic analysis of the effects of immigration, and then we'll add more wrinkles to it to see how we can extend the analysis to make our models more realistic. Now, I'm going to kind of go through this a little bit faster than your textbook does. The real purpose of this isn't to understand something about immigration itself and the effects of immigration on the labor market, but really it's just an example we can use to go through how we can use the model of supply and demand to understand changes in the labor market. So let's think very simply, the most simplistic example possible. If we suddenly go from no immigration, literally zero immigration, to a large influx, like the increase we saw after the Hart-Celler Act in the 60s, the added people, the new immigrants showing up to the country, will shift the supply curve to the right. What we end up with is more people actively looking for jobs. So as a result, our model of supply and demand tells us that shifting the supply curve to the right is going to increase employment, but also decrease the wages received in the market. So here we have a graph showing just this. As the supply curve increases or shifts to the right, employment rises and wages fall. As wages fall, some native workers are going to leave the labor force because the wages being offered for their jobs are too low. They don't see it as worth it to work for those low wages, so they end up leaving the labor force. So what happens with immigration is it decreases the employment of native workers, and even the wages that they receive fall. Now, in this case, we're assuming a lot. We're assuming the fact that immigrants and native-born workers are perfect substitutes, so firms don't care whether they're employing a native or an immigrant. So a firm is ambivalent between a native worker and a foreign worker. What that's saying is that these two workers have no differences in their skills, abilities, the languages that they speak, their cultural habits, their productivity on the job, all these different things. But in reality, this isn't the case. Some workers do not speak English or they don't do so well. They often have less education than American workers. That's one of the reasons why immigrants come to the United States. So instead of being substitutes, they're often thought of as complements. They're not competing over the same jobs, but different jobs. So that's partly where the phrase that immigrants do the jobs that Americans won't do comes from. So here we see what happens to native workers when they're complements to immigrants. The demand for them increases. That's because as complements, they work best together. So remember our example of complements for hot dogs and hot dog buns. If you're going to eat hot dogs, you're going to want more hot dog buns. Very similar here. So more immigrants coming to the country and working, when they're complements, means that firms are going to want more native workers as well. Shifting the demand curve to the right in this case, because the immigrants and the native workers are complements, is going to increase the wages that native workers receive, and it increases their employment. Now, what's important to note here is that not all immigrants are the same skill level, and not all natives are the same skill level. So a richer analysis would consider both high-skilled and low-skilled native workers, decomposing the effect of immigration by the different groups. We could even dial down to specific industries. So there's some industries that immigrants tend to work in much more than other industries. The H-1B visa program for higher skilled workers has effects in fields that are not traditionally thought of as full of immigrants. So some examples are even missing this from their analysis, especially if we're reading a textbook that is, a decade, 15, maybe 20 years old. The theory might not be wrong, but some of the examples might not include higher skilled immigrants. So we're missing out on that. Now, we don't just have to consider the short run. We can also look at what happens in the long run after an increase in immigration. So in the short run, let's go back to our simple example. Let's say wages fall. So firms are hiring more workers at a lower wage. The increase in profitability that firms have because they're now able to hire cheaper workers, they're spending less money on the labor aspect of the production costs. Now firms are going to be willing to invest in more capital. Over time, this is going to help further expand their output, which will then shift their demand curve to the right for workers. They eventually want to hire even more workers, which, eventually over the long run can increase the equilibrium wage. So in the short run, it may have negative effects for native workers, but the increase in immigration could have positive effects in the long run. Now, none of these are guaranteed. I've been talking about how sometimes it can be costly for native workers. Sometimes it could be beneficial for native workers. We're working with very simplistic models here. This isn't to give you some definitive answer. This is what the effect of immigration on native workers or on the US economy is. Just an opportunity to work through some of the effects and to think of what it's like looking at the most simplistic model and then adding more and more wrinkles to it. So let's take a look at another example, high-skilled immigration. A large shock of immigrants in a competitive labor market may not result in large gains for the native population. But there is a perception that high-skilled immigration is different, that it will yield huge benefits because these workers are highly skilled. The basic idea is that unlike what we saw with immigration in general, that first supply and demand curve, if all the immigrants are high skilled, eventually they'll create some sort of human capital externality where their skills and abilities are so good that it makes other people better off in the economy. So imagine a country with almost no economy besides subsistence agriculture. There's very little trade going on. There's no industry, very few, if any, businesses, nothing like that. If high-skilled workers move in, they know how to run a business. They know how to, do mining. They know all these other things that aren't currently going on in the economy. They could come in, start businesses, and soon start growing the economy. If this holds true, if this extreme example holds true, it could also hold true in a more normal context where high-skilled immigrants are coming into a country where they have higher skills than the average worker. In that case, after their arrival, instead of decreasing the demand for natives, there can be positive spillovers or positive externalities that end up increasing the demand for natives because now they're highly skilled. They're either making firms more productive or they're starting their own businesses that can then hire native workers. So here we have a little graph showing this. N represents the supply curve for native workers, and M represents the supply curve after the high-skilled immigrants arrive. So here, N, this supply curve here, native workers, and that's the level of native employment. The supply curve after the immigrants arrive. At this point, M, this is from 0 to N is the natives. From N to M is the additional immigrants that came in. So let's say that these are the highly skilled immigrants that we were talking about on the last slide. Their human capital externalities can increase the demand curve, which is the same as the value of the marginal product of labor. Because they're so productive, they're increasing the value of the marginal product of labor. So we're moving from this curve right here initially out to the supply or demand curve right here, excuse me. So we're now at a higher point. So this can increase the wages that natives earn, as shown by the movement from W0 here. Point E, this was the initial equilibrium before there were immigrants, these high-skilled immigrants coming into the country. Now, after they come in, so they shift the supply curve to the right, but they also shift the demand curve to the right, increase the demand curve. So we're now moving up to this new point, at point C. So the wage here, W1, is higher than it was initially. Now workers are being made, native workers are being made better off. The textbook provides a few examples of this occurring, and they use extreme cases to show you more obvious ways that this happens. So interestingly, Nazi Germany was responsible for 2 instances. Your book only mentions 1. So first one is they expelled all the Jewish faculty from universities in the 1930s. This included some of the leading names in mathematics. Unsurprisingly, the universities that lost these incredible mathematicians became worse off. And those immigrants contributed quite a bit to their new homes, including the war effort in the United States against Nazi Germany. But then the Nazis lost the war, and the Soviet Union and the United States competed to grab as many of their top scientists as possible. Wernher von Braun and some of his friends came to the United States through Operation Paperclip, and they ran the Apollo program. That helped give us not only a man on the moon and winning the space race, but also gave us a lot of new products from microwave ovens to GPS. We're going to briefly touch on the COVID-19 pandemic and how it affected the US labor market. So the pandemic caused a shock to the labor market, unlike anything we've seen in recent history. This is a very different recession from past recessions. When the pandemic hit, businesses were closed and people stayed home. Entire industries experiencing sudden and dramatic drops in demand. At the same time, the government took unprecedented actions to try to contain the virus and support the economy. So we had some very interesting things happening where, on the one hand, people were choosing not to patronize these businesses because of the pandemic and the risk of getting sick. On the other hand, the government, in many cases, wouldn't let people to actually go to those businesses. So we see two things going on at the same time. By using the supply and demand model, we can break down how some of these massive changes affected both wages and employment in various sectors, and how these might continue into the future. So this figure here shows the employment to population ratio from 2018 to 2022. We can see a sharp drop in April 2020, down to under 58%, way down here. During the financial crisis, the employment to population ratio fell to 65%, so way up here. Basically, what this is saying is that this was a historic downturn during the pandemic. Now, some of this was a result of cratering consumer demand. Remember, very few of us wanted to travel and stay in a hotel and go to restaurants in other cities during the pandemic. And some of it was a result of business closures and other non-pharmaceutical interventions implemented by the government. So this figure breaks down the job losses by broad industry category. So we have construction and manufacturing as two of them. These are industries that could not socially distance on the job or work remotely, and they saw the largest employment declines. They also faced closures due to non-pharmaceutical interventions at least some points during the pandemic. On the other hand, we have utilities and finance. They did not see such large declines in employment. They were either deemed essential, like utilities were, or they could be done remotely, like finance. Because so much of the dislocation in jobs were due to legal barriers or concerns related to the spread of the virus, job losses were concentrated in so-called risky industries, unlike normal recessions. So it followed a very different pattern. And we can use the tools of supply and demand in order to understand exactly how these business closures would affect the labor market. We're going to end this with a quick discussion on non-competitive labor markets, in this case, what we call monopsony. Up until now, we've assumed that the labor markets that we're analyzing were what we call competitive. Remember, that means that there are many firms and many workers. No one can influence wages. And if either businesses, the firms themselves, or the workers don't like the terms that are being offered, they can go to someone else and get terms that they do like. These assumptions are great for helping us understand how markets function, but they're not the most realistic scenario. I'm sure that you can, and you have been thinking of examples where these conditions don't hold. You're looking at your experiences in the labor market, in your real life, and seeing that these don't perfectly map reality. We're going to end this chapter by briefly talking about an extreme case, a monopsony. Monopsony occurs when there's only one buyer in a market, and this buyer has significant market power because they're the only name in the business. This allows a monopsonist to influence the price or the wage levels in the market. In the context of a labor market, a monopsony employer has the ability to set wages for workers, as there are no competing employers for the same type of labor. So a monopsonist faces an upward sloping supply curve. Unlike the firms in the competitive market, the monopsonist must pay increasing wages to attract more workers. So the classic example is a company town in a remote location. Since I'm from Pennsylvania, I can think of a lot of examples of company towns, ranging from the coal mines outside of Scranton to better places like Hershey, Pennsylvania. But in order to get people from cities to move to these company towns, the employers have to slowly raise wages to convince more people to join them. Now, our first thought might be to wonder why waste our time learning about an artifact of the past. While company towns are not really a thing in the US today, plenty of firms do face upward sloping supply curves, so they have similar conditions to these old company towns, the monopsonists of the past. By learning about this extreme example, we can learn about how normal firms that face an upward sloping labor supply curve make decisions about both wages and employment. In reality, these firms aren't true monopsonists, but many do have some degree of market power. For example, in rural areas, there might be just one or two major employers, like a hospital or a particular factory. Even in larger cities, some industries like tech or specialized manufacturing may have just a few companies that dominate hiring, and they can behave sort of similar to monopsonists, just to a lesser extent. When firms face an upward sloping supply curve, hiring more workers means they have to offer higher wages, not just to the additional workers, but also to the existing employees. This can make them more cautious about hiring and result in lower wages and employment levels than what we would see in a perfectly competitive market. By understanding the extreme case of monopsony, we can better grasp how smaller degrees of labor market power play out in more typical situations, where firms have some control over wages, but not complete control. So examples can include specialized jobs where there's only a few firms and ones that need workers with very specific skills. Now, when we talk about discrimination in economics, it's a little bit different how most people use the word. Discrimination in economics is treating people differently. So maybe the definition isn't too different, but the normative claims associated around the term are different. So a perfectly discriminating monopolist is not being run by the most racist person out there. A perfectly discriminating monopolist is able to pay each worker exactly what they're willing to work for. They pay them their reservation wage. Typically, companies try to pay workers in the same position, the same, or roughly the same based on their productivity and their seniority to keep people from getting upset. But that's not the case here. Think back to the labor supply curve. Remember how every point along the labor supply curve here represented a specific worker. And where they lie on the curve represents their reservation wage, or the lowest wage that they were willing to work for. So a perfectly discriminating monopsonist would pay each worker exactly their reservation wage. So the figure on the right shows what this would look like graphically. The key point here is that the firm faces an upward sloping labor supply curve, meaning that to attract additional workers, it still needs to offer higher wages. But it doesn't have to increase wages for all workers, only the new ones that it hires. This changes the firm's cost structure. Now, instead of the marginal cost of hiring being higher for each worker, as we will see for the non-discriminating monopolist, the labor supply curve itself reflects the marginal cost of hiring each additional worker. So in this case, the marginal cost curve is the same as the labor supply curve. Let's break this down so it makes more sense. If the perfectly discriminating monopsonist firm wants to hire 10 workers, so the employment of 10 right here, trace that up to the labor supply curve, that's the wage they have to pay, the wage set. And that's what they will pay the 10th worker. The 9th worker will be down here, the 8th a little bit lower, the 7th a little lower than that. Now let's say they want to increase output and hire 30 workers. They're going to have to keep increasing wages for each worker they hire. The 11th will be up here, the 12th here, the 20th here, the 25th here, all the way up to the 30th worker will be right here, a wage of 30. So they have to pay a higher wage for these additional workers, but each worker is getting an additional higher wage. This works like a competitive market. However, the W star, this wage here in equilibrium, is not paid to all workers. It's only paid to the last worker. So whatever this E star employment is, let's call it 40 in this example. So that 40th worker will get what was the equilibrium wage in a competitive market. But in this case, the 39th worker is a little bit lower. The 30th is down here. The 10th worker is way down there. Now, there is zero surplus being captured by the workers in this type of market because each of them is employed at their reservation wage. Each worker is happy. They are working at a wage that they are perfectly willing to work at, but they're not getting any benefit in excess, unlike what we saw in the perfectly competitive market. The profit maximization for the firm happens at point A, where it hires a number of workers that maximizes its profit. It just happens to be, like I said, the same number as in the competitive market. But unlike the competitive market, where everyone is paid the same wage, each worker is paid exactly what they're willing to accept right along the labor supply curve. This allows firms to minimize labor costs while still maximizing their profits. In the real world, firms have a difficult time determining exactly what each worker's reservation wage is, especially because it's not something that you can see in action. It's something that only workers know in their minds. WVU has no idea how much money I'm willing to work for, what the minimum amount that I would work for is. They could hazard a guess. If they wanted to, they could try to cut my wages or offer me a wage cut and see if I'd be willing to stay, but they don't know what that is. Also, there are equity concerns where a lot of workers would be frustrated knowing someone doing the same job as them is making more money than them. So a lot of these firms, a lot of these monopsonist firms are non-discriminating monopsonists. Now, these are firms that have significant buying power in the labor market, meaning that it's only one of or the only employer in the area or in a specific industry. But unlike the discriminating monopsonists that we just saw, which might pay different wages to different workers, a non-discriminating monopsonist pays all workers the same wage. The key challenge for this type of employer is that to attract more workers, it has to raise wages for all employees, not just the additional ones it wanted to hire. So they face a slightly different issue than we saw on the previous slide. As a result, it ends up hiring fewer workers than in the competitive labor market, because each additional worker becomes more costly to employ. So it's different from what we saw from the discriminating monopsonists. For instance, if a company needs more workers but doesn't want to increase wages for everyone, it might decide to limit hiring, accepting that it's going to produce less or operate at a lower capacity rather than paying this higher wage to all employees. So for an example, when I worked in a dorm furniture factory, my third summer there, they increased wages for summer kids in an attempt to attract more kids. And we were coming out of the financial crisis when I was in college. So when I initially started there, they could offer low wages to people who were desperate for work. As time went on, that wasn't the case. They needed to increase wages. Unlike the perfectly discriminating monopsonists, I saw a raise too. All of us guys that were working there for 2-3 years before that got a raise that the new kids got. As a way to keep workers from getting frustrated. A non-discriminating monopsonist faces a supply curve that is a little bit more complicated than the perfectly discriminating monopsonist. It's still an upward sloping supply curve. But because they pay the same wage to all workers, when they want to hire an additional worker, they have to increase wages for all workers. So instead of the marginal cost curve being the same as the supply curve, like before, now it lies above the supply curve. So here we have the labor supply curve for workers. Here's a marginal cost to the firm. Again, it's higher because you're not just increasing by the wage to the next employee, you also have the wages to all the previous employees that have to be counted. So the marginal cost of hiring an additional worker is that new worker's wage plus the difference between that wage and the previous wage that all of the workers were being paid. A profit maximizing non-discriminating monopsonist will hire additional workers until the marginal cost curve crosses the labor demand curve. The perfectly discriminating monopsonist also hired where the marginal cost curve crossed the labor demand curve, but in that case, the marginal cost curve is equal to supply. Now it's a separate curve. It's to the left. So at point A, where the marginal cost curve crosses the labor demand curve, that is the employment level. The value of the marginal product for the last worker hired corresponds to the point VMPM in the market, so right here. The worker is paid a lower wage where their supply curve crosses the number of employees hired. So at point A, we trace that down. There is EM workers. Where that crosses the supply curve right here is the wage it's going to be paid to workers in this monopsonist, or from this monopsonist. Unlike the perfectly discriminating monopsonist or the competitive labor market, where employment would be here, we end up with lower employment and lower wages being paid for those workers. Now, many firms face an upward sloping labor supply curve, although the degree of slope varies depending on the type of labor market that they're operating in. An upward sloping supply curve means that firms need to offer higher wages to attract additional workers, which is often the case in labor markets where competition for workers is limited, or where workers have preferences for specific locations or industries or working conditions. Jobs tend to be specialized, meaning that you need certain types of experience and education to perform them. Companies also have their own particular characteristics, whether it's their location, the amenities of the job, non-wage benefits, or job characteristics that make them as if they are a monopsonist. You can't quite get the same thing anywhere else. For instance, there are very few places where I can go be an economist with the same or similar job duties as I do here at WVU. For me, it's a special place, and there's very few or no other places that can offer me the same thing. When you consider my colleagues who do similar research that complements mine, WVU is very much like a monopsonist for me and has an upward sloping supply curve for labor market economists like me. So our chapter ends with exploring the impact of minimum wage for non-discriminating monopsonists. This is interesting, and I do think it's worth reading, but I don't want to go into this too much because we'd have to wade into the entire minimum wage debate. We have to talk about what it's like in a perfectly competitive market, and then how it can work for a non-discriminating monopsonist. The textbook shows two examples where they find basically the opposite things. That's a little bit beyond what I want to get into in this class. So with this, the lecture is going pretty long. I'll end it here. This will be the last lecture before the midterm exam. I have a study guide with some general topics for you to go over, but there are a few things I want to hit on first. One, you are not going to have to draw supply and demand curves for the exam. You can have scratch paper for you where you can draw them out to help you answer questions, but there's no really good way to have you actually physically draw them in eCampus in any sort of computer program. So that's not something I want to try to make you do. This exam will basically have essay questions. Some of them will get at this shifts in supply and demand, but it'll be a little bit more theory based than purely shifting supply and demand curves. The topics on the study guide are a little bit broad, but they will cover all the questions that are being asked on the exam. I will also be answering some questions from your two-question assignment from the previous chapter, and I can go over any of the topics a little bit more in depth if you need, I don't know, I guess I'll say more help for the exam for those questions. So with that, I'll end, and we can get ready for the exam.